My oh my, what Rapture could have been. Just look at the elegance, the absolute beauty, the incredible atmosphere. But all of that was ruined on New Year's Eve in 1958 due to the bombing of the Kashmir restaurant. What followed afterwards shaped Rapture and its downfall due to a civil war between Frank Fontaine and Andrew Ryan. In today's video, we'll be diving into the entirety of Rapture's civil war, its aftermath, and the turmoil Rapture went through during the Civil War. So, ladies and gentlemen, this video is going to be quite a long one, so if you don't mind, would you kindly sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. From the very beginning of Rapture, there was always some built-up tension due to Andrew Ryan's philosophical beliefs where the strong and wealthy would thrive and the weak and the poor would be left behind. In a society that had the idea to have the rich and poor constantly interact, there were bound to be issues from the start. For example, the inequalities between the rich and the poor caused an immense amount of conflict between the two groups. Frank Fontaine noticed this and decided to exploit the inequalities to try and achieve power for himself. At the time, Frank Fontaine started coming up with an endgame plan. The citizens of Rapture also, at this time, started to suffer from considerable psychological strain due to the isolation and confinement of Rapture and its environment. Ryan recognized that this was becoming an issue, so he invited Dr. Sophia Lamb, a trained psychologist, to Rapture to try to help relieve these problems. Well, it seems that Dr. Lamb had some intentions of her own, so she elected to escalate tensions and the psychological problems of Rapture's citizens instead of helping them. After finding out what Lamb was doing, Ryan had her arrested and imprisoned within Persephone under some false accusations and pretenses in order to contain the influence she started to gain. Sophia Lamb would remain in prison in Persephone for the entirety of Rapture's Civil War. In addition to the psychological problems Rapture citizens were already dealing with, a condition known as confined environment psychosis started to create conflict in this constrained environment of Rapture. This, along with hyper-competitive economic systems that Rapture stood by, violence was soon to follow. During this time, Adam was also discovered, which caused the balance of power to shift. Fontaine's past as a criminal and his lust for power was multiplied with the news of Adam. The wonder drug known as Adam destabilized people mentally, while also giving them a destructive force right into the palm of their hands. With Fontaine constantly and intentionally causing tensions to become more and more severe, Rapture was beginning to get ready to implode. Fontaine, who would later become Atlas, and we'll get to that, eventually tried to overthrow Ryan and seize Rapture for himself by using excessive force. He used everything that Adam had to offer, plus Adam-wielding thugs to outgun and overpower the minimal police force that Rapture had. Fontaine then turned his attention on terrorizing the rest of the population, and then soon after, the economy of Rapture collapsed after this event. Due to Andrew Ryan and his absolutionist values, he was late and too slow to intervene when Fontaine kept growing in power and refused to regulate the Adam production. Instead, Ryan decided to leave it up to the choice of the consumer. Only when it was too late, he tried to take the required measurements to fight Fontaine's war for the control of Rapture. One of the most important events that sparked Rapture's collapse was when Andrew Ryan passed a law which stated and prohibited that any contact with citizens on the surface was not allowed, as Andrew Ryan feared that what he called parasites would be sent to come and destroy his utopia. Ryan believed, for one reason or another, that secrecy would be the only way to allow Rapture to flourish and be able to build his economy and society that those damn parasites could not and would not control, destroy, or ruin. In passing this law, Fontaine saw an opening due to the demand of goods from the surface. All of this led to, you guessed it, Frank Fontaine. Fontaine, at this time, was a fishery owner who specialized in organizing a smuggling ring to fill the demands that people either wanted or needed from the surface by giving them the goods that they wanted or needed. By doing this, Fontaine was able to live comfortably with the wealth that he was achieving. This wealth, however, would be used to spread corruption and propaganda while expanding his commercial operations. This gave him all the power and money he needed to exploit the discovery of Adam by Dr. Brigid Tenenbaum, who at this point wasn't very well known. Tenenbaum witnessed and watched as a fisherman with crippled hands was playing catch at a dock. This same fisherman experienced, as some would say, a miracle. His experience was getting bit by a mysterious sea slug which was native to the area around Rapture, and started to immediately heal his hand to his original state. The natural properties of this mysterious sea slug allowed Dr. Tenenbaum to eventually develop and perfect a revolutionary genetic substance, or goo, known as Adam. When all of the mainstream labs turned her away, essentially halting her research, she had no other choice but to seek out help financially from Fontaine and his smugglers. Fontaine, being as smart as he is, recognized the potential that Adam could offer, so he decided to open up Fontaine Futuristics, which was a company whose purpose was to harness and use the power of the genetic modification that Adam caused and provided. In addition to Tenenbaum, Fontaine brought in a well-known and more classically trained geneticist named Dr. Yi Suchong. Dr. Suchong was tasked to spearhead the development of plasmids, which were commercial products that provided the user with various genetic modifications. Shortly after, the Adam culture started booming and took hold of Rapture. Things like tennis events became sponsored by telekinesis. Dentist office advertised a free plasmid sample with a routine root canal. Other products, such as Fresh Hair, Sports Boost, and Instant Piano Prodigy, offered citizens an easy way to obtain things like a full head of hair, physical fitness, or musical genius. Cosmetic surgery was greatly changed when doctors like J.S. Steinman realized Adam's full potential, and so on. Essentially, at the start, plasmids were used for everyday tasks and activities. Due to so much product of Adam being sold, Fontaine saw his power rise exponentially, almost rivaling the power of Andrew Ryan himself. Even with Fontaine's rapid growth of power, Ryan still failed to understand Fontaine's intentions and the threat that Adam would pose to Rapture. When this was a small problem, it could have been stopped, yet Ryan did nothing about it at all. As a matter of fact, at first, Ryan even refused to listen to people who warned him of the potential ramifications of Adam. But still, Ryan stuck by his philosophy and put responsibility on the individual and not a system of government. When Ryan finally started to see the significance of Adam's power, he still chose to not take any action. If he were to take action, however, he believed that he would be going against his own morals, of his freed market ideology, and in an individual's freedom that Rapture itself was founded upon. With the negative side effects of Adam usage becoming more and more clear, Ryan still chose to not interfere. He believed that the great chain of society and Rapture would correct the issue. He told business owners, who at the time hoped that Ryan would intervene, to simply offer a better product, and asking, "What use is our ideology if our product isn't tested?" Eventually, after a long period of time, Andrew Ryan finally understood the threat that Adam and Fontaine posed to Rapture, marking him as someone to be watched. He also realized that he missed out on the Adam mark and laminated his rival's foresight into buying genotypes and nucleotide sequences. I have no idea what those are, but it sounds pretty confusing, so if I said it wrong, I apologize. Anyways, back to the video. Ryan started to figuratively feel the great chain pulling away from him. In his attempt to give the great chain a tug, it resulted in Sullivan and other members of his personal security team to investigate all of Fontaine's businesses to potentially expose all of his criminal activities between himself and his crew of smugglers, which was led by Peach Wilkins. Good old Peachy. This proved fruitless, as Fontaine offered, coerced, or even murdered any witnesses who would dare to reveal his crimes. Ryan's men eventually turned to torture tactics and other harsh methods in an attempt to gain all of the information that Ryan needed to probe and prove that Frank Fontaine was a traitor to Rapture. Despite multiple public protests, Ryan ordered that everyone convicted of smuggling would be subjected to capital punishment to maintain and ensure his control over Rapture. Andrew Ryan continued to carry out his personal war on Fontaine and the rest of his smuggling ring in Rapture. While this was going on, Fontaine fought with Ryan on a different front with his charity angle. This was inspired by Sophia Lamb's idea of the Rapture Family and everything left behind after she was arrested. So, Fontaine decided to open up Fontaine's Home for the Poor, which was used to exploit the poor during their worst times. As I mentioned earlier, Fontaine was a very intelligent man, and an even better con man who could exploit people at will. He realized that he didn't need to build Rapture to make people worship you. In his own words, he says that, and I quote, "You just need to make them believe they're worth a nickel," end quote. Essentially, this gave the poor a false sense of hope and a vision that Rapture was about to be accepting of everyone. Bill McDonough referred to all of Fontaine's poorhouses as recruiting centers. Man, he was right. He also came to the conclusion that if Ryan didn't take any sort of decisive action, they'd end up dealing with an entire army of splicers. People who took refuge in these poorhouses were usually used for human experiments, like Roland Wallace, who had a new combat plasmid which Fontaine futuristics were starting to rapidly develop, tested on him. On the other side of Fontaine's charity consisted of Little Sisters orphanages. These orphanages were supposed to house these young girls, but were used for something far more sinister. All of the little girls who ended up in these orphanages were forced to become Little Sisters, which was the alternate method for making large amounts of Adam, since the sea slugs alone couldn't provide enough Adam to keep up with the commercial purposes and the commercial use of Adam production for plasmids. Ryan's war with Frank Fontaine became increasingly more and more violent. These incidents actually represented the true start of Rapture's civil war. The multiple battles between Ryan's security and Fontaine's splicers would end up foreshadowing the nature of the war that would ensue between Ryan and Fontaine. Ryan decided to proceed with early raids against Fontaine's criminal operations, which already showed how powerful plasmids were in an instance of armed conflict. Finally, Ryan and Sullivan managed to catch a break in terms of Fontaine's smuggling operation. Yet at this time, Fontaine still managed to be out of Andrew Ryan's grasps. That was until Peach Wilkins, which was one of Fontaine's smugglers, decided to cut a deal with Ryan and essentially rat out Fontaine. McDonough suggested to Ryan that they had a valid reason to now arrest Fontaine, but that they were in dangerous territory. He also wanted Ryan to make it very clear that Fontaine's business interests wouldn't be touched. Well, Fontaine had other plans in mind. He decided that he was going to make a final stand against Ryan's security and go down guns blazing, rather than being taken as a prisoner. On September 12, 1958, Ryan's men ordered a final all-out attack on Fontaine and the rest of his remaining supporters. Immediately the next morning, the Rapture Standard paper wrote out the famous headline, "Ryan takes down smuggling operation. Fontaine and his thugs were killed in a fiery shootout." Over the next few months, The rest of the supporters and loyalists of Fontaine were tracked down, rounded up, and arrested. With no place to keep this large amount of prisoners, the Council of Rapture decided to convert Fontaine's department store into a makeshift and, quite frankly, a rather ghetto prison. This provided Ryan with a place to lock up splicers who went insane under the false accusations that they were working for Frank Fontaine. Ryan also imprisoned political opponents that he considered troublesome, people who had previously worked for Fontaine, and finally, anyone who generally caused Ryan legal problems, like Herschel Weiss, who was suing him for false advertising. At this time, Ryan was asserting total power and ruling Rapture with an iron fist. After this improvised prison was established, security was hastily prepared. Following this, Fontaine's department store was separated from Rapture and sunk to the bottom of an ocean trench. There were some supplies that were sent to inmates, but usually the prisoners were left to fend for themselves as the store slowly weakened under the ocean's natural pressure. With Fontaine being quote-unquote dead, Andrew Ryan's actions afterwards were supported by a majority of Rapture's population. At the same time, others began to question how much power over Rapture that Andrew Ryan should actually have. There were citizens who thought of Frank Fontaine's department store to that of a gulag, while other citizens complained about having to provide food and water to those who were imprisoned there. The ending of 1958 in Rapture caused a false sense of relief. However, this peace would be short-lived at this time, and on a much larger scale, a conflict was still to come. To Andrew Ryan's knowledge, Frank Fontaine was officially dead. However, these reports turned out to be over-exaggerated and completely false. Fontaine had decided to come up with a master plan to get back at Ryan and to take Rapture for himself. He decided to fake his own death to assume a new identity. From now on, he was the revolutionary man known as Atlas. To quote an audio diary from Bioshock, Fontaine states that, quote, "Ryan wanted Frank Fontaine dead. I just gave him what he wanted. As Atlas, I got a new face, a clean record, and a fresh start." End quote. The aftermath of Fontaine's fake death proved that more problems were to come for Rapture. Andrew Ryan decided to nationalize Fontaine Futuristics, which was another betrayal of his philosophies. Originally, Rapture was built to escape government and anyone Ryan deemed as a parasite. But by nationalizing Fontaine Futuristics, he justified this by claiming it was to maintain economic stability. This, however, wasn't the truth. In doing so, this caused a shakeup within Rapture and slowly started the downward decline of Rapture. Bill McDonough, who was a longtime friend of Ryan, resigned from Rapture's central console to protest Ryan's actions. Also during this time, Bridget Tenenbaum disappeared due to a crisis within her conscience. Due to her being with the Little Sisters, a sort of maternal instinct started to manifest, even though she thought she buried those types of emotions a long time ago. She hid in an underground safe house below the streets of Olympus Heights to develop a plasmid to rescue Little Sisters. She also used this as a safe house for those same rescued Little Sisters. This began her secret mission to try and rescue as many of the Little Sisters in Rapture as she possibly could. With Fontaine and Tenenbaum both being out of the picture, this left one person left who had the knowledge of how Atom, plasmids, and the Little Sisters worked: Dr. Yi Suchong. In the late months of 1958, posters of "Who is Atlas" started popping up all around Rapture. Many of the citizens who lived within Fontaine's poorhouses were some of the first recruits to try and form an army and overthrow Andrew Ryan. His plans, however, were halted due to Atlas being imprisoned in Fontaine's department store. He was charged by Ryan for being a supporter of Frank Fontaine. While in prison, Atlas figured out a way to send coded messages to Rapture by radio. However, he couldn't control his supporters directly in the city or escape the prison for his planned rebellion. Forced to wait and bide his time, Atlas still saw an opportunity here. He organized the prisoners and gained their loyalty by providing them food and medical care. This, however, only had limited success. Also during this failure, Atlas ordered his agents, who were still in Rapture, to obtain his ace in the hole from Dr. Suchong, but as I mentioned, this too was a total failure. And unfortunately, due to how Bioshock Infinite intertwined with Bioshock 1, I need to mention this. On December 31st, 1958, Elizabeth arranged a deal with Atlas, which resulted in a jailbreak for himself and his surviving supporters. Upon his return to Rapture, he quickly set all of his plans in motion. What happened next lives in Rapture infamy. In a televised broadcast that night on New Year's Eve, Ryan acknowledged everything that happened in the previous year, but he offered a toast to Rapture that 1959 would be Rapture's finest year. Just moments after the broadcast ended, an incident at the Kashmir restaurant occurred. The bombing of the Kashmir was the true and total start of the Rapture Civil War. For New Year's Eve, a masquerade ball was organized for all of Rapture's elite class. During this ball, a group of Atlas's organized terrorists launched an attack at the Kashmir with bombs that were planted in key locations. This attack killed and wounded many of the attendees. One of the victims was Ryan's mistress, Diane McClintock, who was injured during this planned attack. The ball proved to be an absolute opportune moment for Atlas and his supporters to launch a surprise attack. As the attack began, explosions rocked the entirety of the building, and party-goers heard swarms of splicers storming in yelling, "Long live Atlas and death to Ryan," as the slaughter of the innocent crowd began. Those who weren't killed by the bombs or by Atlas's splicers were trampled as the crowds panicked to try to get out of the area. The aftermath of the bombings caused a huge jump in sales of combat plasmids like Incinerate and Electrobolt, thus causing an atom shortage. The solution was to kidnap young girls and convert them into little sisters for mass atom production. The Civil War also caused a huge increase in civilian atom usage, and that was for a good reason. This was a self-defense measure that Rapture citizens felt that they needed to take. Overall, Rapture was in total chaos, and most of the population was either growing increasingly mentally unstable or completely addicted to Adam. Although Fontaine was quote-unquote dead, Atlas rose from the ashes. He became an adversary that proved to be much more dangerous than Frank Fontaine ever was. Fontaine was looked down upon as a criminal by Rapture's public. Atlas was mysterious and represented an alternative to how Andrew Ryan was ruling over Rapture at this time. In a desperate attempt to silence Atlas, Andrew Ryan ordered to have Atlas's followers rounded up and sent into detention at Apollo Square. Ryan desperately hoped that this would put an end to the war by essentially imprisoning Atlas's followers. As you and I both know, that didn't work out at all. During the war, plasmid technologies reached their peak due to their effectiveness as weapons of war and for self-defense. With the demand of Atom increasing day by day, new plasmids were developed along with existing plasmids that were being upgraded. Due to the increase of plasmid production, Atom became a very scarce, valuable, and sought-after substance. Ryan Industries then began to use Little Sisters to mass-produce Atom by converting them into Atom gatherers. This allowed for them to walk around Rapture and extract the Atom from dead corpses of splicers with their Atom extraction needles. This was a far better option and more efficient method to producing Atom, rather than harvesting the Atom from the sea slug as it was initially done. In the long term, this turned out to be problematic. As Little Sisters usually carried large amounts of Atom with them, they became prime targets of Atom-addicted and desperate people within Rapture trying to get their fix of Atom. The desperation of trying to save their atom production caused Ryan Industries to employ Yi Suchong. They wanted him to develop an armed protector with the nickname of the Big Daddy. Suchong wanted to genetically imprint the little sisters on test subjects that were placed within armored diving suits. A prototype of these armored Big Daddies were the Alpha series, who retained their sense of free will while having the ability to use plasmids. After problems with the Alpha series made them unworkable, a new series was developed that was stronger physically but lacked the free will and lacked the ability to use plasmids. Either they were armed with a gigantic drill or with a very powerful rivet gun. Big Daddies represented a strong threat to anyone who attempted to fight them or interfere with the little sisters that they were protected after the imprinting process was finally a success. Even with how strong these Big Daddies were, this did little to stop desperate people from attempting to kill them to get to the little sisters. Sometimes entire teams of Atlas's revolutionaries conducted raids that were centered around killing a Big Daddy to gain access to the little sister's atom. During an audio diary that was recorded by Diane McClintock, it states that they, quote, went on a raid outside the wire today. We snagged 31 rounds of buckshot, 4 frag grenades, a shotgun, and 34 atom. We lost McGee, Epstein, and Villette. We got one of those goddamn Big Daddies in the bargain, though. End quote. Diane McClintock joined Atlas's revolutionaries after the New Year's attack due to the anger she had towards Andrew Ryan for ignoring her after that attack. Just so you guys know for the context. With Andrew Ryan's initial intentions for Rapture, it was to be a peaceful utopia, so only a few weapons were allowed into the city initially for protection of the higher-ups of Rapture or for entertainment purposes, like the Rapture firing range. However, when the war broke out, citizens found unique ways to create newer and stronger weapons for themselves. For example, grenade launchers and chemical throwers were created with essentially scrap materials. In addition to that, defensive weapons like turrets and security bots were assembled in the same way. Also, household utilities like frying pans, golf clubs, rolling pins, etc. were used as melee weapons in melee combat. Essentially, everyone's energy went from making money and living their lives in Rapture to providing and trying to secure their own survival. Ryan attempted to impose order by instituting martial law in Apollo Square in order to stop suspected Atlas supporters before they could do anything destructive or harmful to Rapture or its citizens. Ryan also used the power of propaganda through a series of PSAs through a broadcast over Rapture's speaker system to counter the supporters of Atlas and to raise Rapture's citizen morale. Publications of support of Atlas's rebellion were shut down and removed. The bathysphere travel system was also locked down, and the only people who were allowed to have access to them were Ryan and his closest followers, due to the bathyspheres being keyed by the genetic frequency of Ryan and those followers. In the early stages of the war, Atlas and his forces got the upper hand, due to their use of the surprise attack on the Kashmir and by destroying citizens' confidence of their own safety within Rapture. This set the brutal tone of the war that was to follow. Warfare to gain power was a foreign affair to Ryan and other citizens in Rapture, who only wanted the open competition of the marketplace that Andrew Ryan had initially wanted. Atlas's atom-fueled guerrilla warfare was effective enough that McDonough tried to convince Ryan to seek a peace negotiation, offering Fontaine futuristics to Atlas. Ryan, however, refused McDonough's suggestion and was determined to regain his Rapture no matter the cost. With Ryan becoming more corrupt, this caused his longtime friend McDonough to turn his back on Ryan and try to go through with an assassination attempt which was unsuccessful. In the end, Ryan killed McDonough and his corpse was hung on Ryan's so-called trophy wall of betrayers. Ultimately, it was Suchong who suggested an unconventional plan to break the stalemate that divided Rapture. His proposal was that of altering the structure of the already available plasmids to make the users susceptible to mental suggestion through the use of pheromones. This was the ultimate betrayal of Ryan's philosophy, to deny a citizen's free will. However, Ryan agreed to Suchong's plan and tried to justify that Atlas and his supporters would have eventually made everyone their slaves and free will would have ceased to exist in any case. This obviously wasn't true at all, and essentially Andrew Ryan was trying to justify breaking his own morals with illogical reasonings. Anyways, I digress. With the pheromones being implemented into plasmids, it did end up turning the war into Ryan's favor for a short time. Atlas, who was currently at his most desperate state and also left with only a few unspliced followers who weren't affected by Ryan's pheromones, was forced to turn to his ace in the hole. This ace in the hole was going to change everything for Atlas, and this ace in the hole was Jack Ryan, Andrew Ryan's own bastardized and illegitimate son. If you'd like to watch the video that I did on Jack's story, there will be a card at the top right of the screen or a link down in the description. If you've played through the entirety of the original Bioshock, there really isn't too much to dive into within this section of the video. However, I will bring up a few key points just in case some viewers are unaware. Before Fontaine faked his death, he made arrangements to purchase the embryo of Ryan's illegitimate son, which was being carried by an exotic dancer that Ryan had slept with. Her name was Jasmine Jolene. With Frank Fontaine realizing that Rapture's security was coded to his genetic frequency to attack him whenever it would sense his genetic frequency, he realized that Jack could be a useful tool to help him destroy Ryan. Fontaine ordered Suchong to use his genetic technology to implement fast growth within Jack, which would allow him to reach adulthood within a few years. Jack was also mentally conditioned with a control phrase codenamed "Would You Kindly," and this would cause him to become a slave to whomever said the phrase, and he would have to obey their every command. As Jack reached Rapture through the plane crash and the lighthouse at the beginning of the game, he reached the surface of Rapture through a bathysphere. Upon arrival, Atlas spoke to him over the shortwave radio and acted as a friend to Jack, and helped guide him around to find his way around this unknown city. The entire time Atlas guided Jack around Rapture, he engraved into Jack's brain that Ryan was their enemy and that they would kill him together. Eventually, due to the "Would You Kindly" control phrase, Jack was led to the personal office of Andrew Ryan. Here, Ryan revealed that he learned that Jack was his son and a mind-controlled slave to Atlas. With Ryan having activated Rapture's self-destruct sequence, he used the same code phrase against Jack. This is when he ordered Jack to obey and kill him with a golf club, which, of course, Jack had no choice but to obey. After the death of Ryan, and with Jack stopping the self-destruct sequence of Rapture, Atlas revealed himself that he was indeed Frank Fontaine. With Jack killing Ryan and stopping Rapture's self-destruction, he basically handed Rapture over to Frank Fontaine just as he wanted. After getting chased away by security bots after Fontaine revealed himself to Jack, he crawled through an air vent shaft with the help of the rescued little sisters. Unfortunately, there was a hole in one of the vents, causing Jack to fall through and was knocked out in the process. Later, he awoke within Tenenbaum's safe house, where she was able to disable some of the mental conditioning that Fontaine had instilled within Jack. Everything, of course, except for one final code phrase, Code Yellow. This would cause Jack's heart to slowly stop over a period of time. To remedy this last code phrase, Jack needed to find 2 doses of Lot 192, which, of course, he is successful in doing so. When Fontaine finds out that Jack had broken all of the mind control phrases and what he called spells, he injected himself with a massive amount of Atom and became a physical force armed with multiple plasmids. In the end, Jack, with the help of the Little Sisters, defeated Fontaine. And obviously, However you treated the little sisters during your playthrough, either saving or harvesting them, would change the outcome of the finale of the game. The Civil War brought the city of Rapture, which was at the height of its civilization, to fall into complete ruin. The blame for the war, however, was due to the principles of two very different individuals. Frank Fontaine was a man without conscience, a power-hungry thug who was willing to murder and destroy anything in his path to achieve that power. Then you have Andrew Ryan. He was completely set in his ways with his philosophies at first and permitted men like Fontaine to rise in power unchecked. Later on, he abandoned his principles and philosophies and embraced brutal tendencies to defend his city. With both Andrew Ryan and Frank Fontaine dead, and with many of the Little Sisters gone, Rapture went into a very dark period. Every day, its infrastructure would continue to decay, and many areas around Rapture started to become flooded. The remaining citizens of Rapture, however, developed survival strategies that allowed the city to continue and exist 8 years later for the events of Bioshock 2. In conclusion, the Rapture Civil War has always been one of the most fascinating pieces of backstory and lore that I've personally always enjoyed learning and reading about. How one man's power for hunger and another man's will to try to stop that at all costs, despite going against his own principles, really makes you think about things that occur within real life. War is never a pleasant thing, whether it's in a video game or in real life. But the simple fact and the question of why does war exist truly interests me. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the story of the Rapture Civil War. And with that being said, I will talk to you guys in the next video. Take care, Rapture family. Take care.